Welcome, everyone, to our session titled How Can Government Organizations Modernize Procurement to Respond to the Changing World? And I'm excited about this conversation today because everyone listening is impacted by government's ability to modernize, whether you're buying on behalf of the government, whether you're selling to the government, or whether you're simply a citizen using government-facing services. So I'm delighted today to be joined by two respected and experienced public procurement experts representing both academia and the US government, the EU and German perspective, as well as the United States federal government perspective. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Essig, who's a professor at the University of Bundeswehr Munich and holds several prominent positions within the university, including director of the Research Center of Law and Management of Public Procurement. Professor Essig has published more than 280 papers and books in the field of purchasing and supply management. I hope that's more papers than books. I'd be impressed either way. Mike Hogan works in the Pentagon as Chief of Sourcing and Transformation in the Installations and Sourcing Division of the U.S. Air Force. And Mike is a career contracting officer with 30 years of federal acquisition experience throughout Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America, and currently leads the U.S. Air Force's Category Management and Transformation Initiative. So welcome to both of you. It's wonderful to be with you today. I wanted to start with just a very broad question to maybe help set the landscape for those listening today. So I'll start with the professor. So what excites you most about what's happening either in the EU or Germany specifically about modernizing their public procurement?
I think we've taken a long path in public procurement, and what's most interesting at the moment is that we really professionalize public procurement in a way I think we did never before in the last 10 or 15 years. We're really moving towards a profession public buying, which means we have strategic public procurement. And I think most citizens see now the strategic importance of public procurement. Just if you look at the sheer numbers, we spend in Europe more than 15% of the gross domestic product in public procurement. That's more than 2 trillion euros. So this is a huge task, and it's really of strategic importance.
Agreed. Let me ask you the same question, Mike. What excites you most about what's happening in the U.S. federal government to modernize public procurement?
Absolutely. So when I started procurement 30-some years ago, it was very much an administrative kind of process-driven thing that people went through to get the items, goods, and services that they needed. When we look now, when we think about the budgetary pressure, kind of the great nation competition, some of the organizational changes happening within the DoD, the stand-up of the U.S. Space Force, as well as the technical innovations and kind of, science fiction things such as machine learning, hypersonics, artificial intelligence, acquisition is now playing a key role in all of that. And what's better is our customers, our requiring activities see that, and they now seek us out. So we're turning from a very administrative, keep me out of jail type of mentality to, being sought after to solve real mission and real national interest problems. And so we're in the heart of that. So it's super exciting to be a part of a huge solution.
There's probably no greater example of the strategic importance of a public procurement team than during COVID. So let me ask you, Professor Essig, what worked well and what did not work well in terms of the public procurement response to COVID in Germany or the EU more broadly?
I think both in Germany and all over the European Union, we had a big problem during the crisis with all kind of medical stuff, things like masks. And I think this is the same all over the world, where, of course, critical during the crisis. And we had a lot of bad press for public procurement during the crisis because they were not always able to deliver things like masks. But I think nobody assumed in advance that we need them really as a strategic good during that time. If we look on the phase before COVID-19 and the phase after COVID-19, we already had some issues in public procurement in general before COVID-19, which means that it was not always easy to find capable suppliers. the average number of suppliers or the average number of bidders for call for bids went down in the last 10 years from 5 to 3 in average for a European-wide call for tenders. And of course, this is a trend which was a little bit stopped by COVID-19. And now, of course, public procurement is of great importance for private suppliers because we're spending all the money through public procurement, which should help to rebuild the economy. So the strategic importance of public procurement even grows because the government now has specific, let's say, strategic goals how to spend that money. To spend it on sustainable products, to spend it on innovative products, to support SMEs and all that kind of stuff. So I think the strategic importance of public procurement grows, and this is a question of implementation. How are we really able to implement strategic goals in public procurement?
Why are there less suppliers competing for opportunities? Have the barriers increased?
For suppliers, it was easier to get a contract from other customers than the public sector, because if you deal with the public sector, you normally get a huge amount of pieces of paper you have to sign, and you have to make a huge bid and all that kind of stuff. So before the crisis, we really had problems in finding good suppliers for the public sector. And I think that changed.
Yeah, so during challenging economic times, suppliers are willing to sort of put up with the bureaucracy and maybe the barriers to entering and growing in the government space because it's one of the few opportunities available to them.
That's one of the things, and I think that the second thing is that we're really seeking more towards strategic goals, really trying to find innovative suppliers, really trying to find sustainable suppliers, because we also use it as a lever for strategic goals of the government to rebuild economy, let's say, in a more sustainable, more innovative way than we did maybe before.
I think some of the challenges are particularly acute, small and medium-sized businesses. And Mike, I know in the U.S. federal government, there's a mandate to ensure a certain percentage of your procurement spending is directed to small businesses. But I know at the U.S. Air Force in particular, you have a focus on purchasing from local businesses. So talk to me a little bit about some of the challenges that they're selling to the Air Force and how you're overcoming some of those challenges.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is a really exciting program. So if you think about what in a small business's shoes, what has happened to them over the past couple of decades, as a society, we moved more towards buying through e-commerce. So if I have a brick and mortar store, on the high street, that starts getting less foot traffic, and that then means less sales. As Michael kind of alluded to, the government can be very complex and difficult to build with, to buy from and to do business with. So we've seen, kind of the economic pressures on small business. When you add COVID on top of that, it becomes incredibly difficult. And so the Air Force, we realized this, fortunately, before COVID. We saw our vendor base go from, small businesses from roughly about 10,000 discrete vendors to right around 8,000. There was a kind of thought that may be because of, strategic sourcing, these sort of things. And while we show that we're putting more dollars into small business now more than ever, we do see kind of that reduction of our small business base. So we needed a way to reinvigorate that, recognizing that small businesses, they are innovators. They're very responsive. They're kind of the seed corn that kind of grows our economy. So we launched what's called First Look. And so teaming with Amazon and others, we were able to kind of reverse those negative trends of e-commerce where e-commerce is very fast. It's good to get competition. It's easy and handy, but it doesn't comply with the public policy perspective of small businesses. Now we've infused those two together. So we saw the benefits of the e-commerce. And now we're finding small businesses that we've never dealt with on our doorstep and repairing some of that connective business tissue between us and our communities that we live in. So we've seen, 10,000 vendors that we haven't done business with before. We now know who they are, and we can start educating them and moving them through the continuum of, the micro small purchases that we do on credit card to our more complex, reinvigorating that supply base that's defending our nation and helping our economy overall.
That's a great example of electronic marketplaces breaking down the barriers for those small, local, diverse businesses. Professor Essig, what is happening in Germany in terms of its acceptance of electronic marketplaces? You partnered with Amazon Business on a study to sort of dig into this issue. What did you find?
First of all, we have to know that we have in Europe a broad base of different public buyers, from the smallest institution to the biggest. We assume, we don't even know, we assume we have round about 30,000 public buying institutions in Germany alone. We don't really know the exact number. That's, first of all, an issue for itself that we don't have that data available. That's a pity. But we had, as you said, we did a small study. We had a closer look on different public buying institutions, on the federal, on the state, and on the local level, concerning the usage of electronic marketplaces. First of all, we found that more than half of them already uses electronic marketplaces. Yeah, that's for me already an interesting issue, because that's relatively a higher number than I expected in advance. On the other hand, when we had a closer look on the regulation, we found that regulation does not even include in any place the word electronic marketplace. So there is no specific regulation on electronic marketplaces. Nevertheless, what the public buying institutions told us is, for them, electronic marketplace is not a technological issue, even though it's a technology. They don't have any technological issues with e-marketplaces. For them, it's mostly an issue of efficiency, and it's an issue of regulation. So if I combine that findings, I can say, yes, of course, maybe there is something, maybe we should do something with regulation. But on the other hand, for me, it's always a question how to implement it, not a question of regulation. So I'm always not always sure whether really regulation helps for everything. Sometimes it's better to do it than.
Yes, so there's no regulation that explicitly mentions electronic marketplace. At the same time, there's no regulation that specifically prohibits its use. And I think it depends upon the interpretation of the buyer. And sometimes you have more risk averse that are looking for that phrase. And sometimes you have those that are a little more creative, or just understand that it's an acceptable use for some purchases. That's interesting. In the U.S., in 2018, Congress enacted a law that directed the Department of General Services, which is the central procurement agency for the U.S. federal government, to establish an e-commerce portal program, which is being implemented now. And I think it's certainly helped drive the acceptability of Amazon Business and other suppliers in this space. And of course, I'm biased, but I think it's a tremendously efficient and high value way to purchase a lot of these commodities. Mike, talk to me a little bit about some of the other transformation initiatives underway in the Air Force. I know you've done a lot around category management and data analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's really kind of brought procurement to the forefront is when you think of strategic sourcing, you think of an acquisition only led kind of solution. And through category management, we actually stole that or adopted that from commercial practice and changed it to kind of work within the federal space. But it doesn't focus on just the acquisition solution. It has much other things such as demand management, demand shaping, understanding our requirements. Sometimes we ask for the wrong thing. And so I think it's very easy to kind of walk down that well-worn path. But if we look up and we look at, strategically, what are we trying to accomplish? Working with category managers, working with functional experts, working with big data, we can start to see a different picture and start thinking about total cost of ownership, much like we do in our own personal lives, where I take into account all the cost things that will happen with this procurement rather than that particular item. So I think it's allowed us to really look at things in a much more intuitive way, but that requires us to be comfortable working with data, to team with industry, and to make sure that, we're not working in our own silos, to partner both internally and externally. And we've seen time and time again where when we start having some of these sort of conversations and we work with internal customers as well as external customers, we found sometimes we solve problems that we didn't realize we had, or we build capability through relationships or platforms that, come just in time. So as COVID rolled out, we had a robust supply chain that we could utilize. We had teaming arrangements, and we had data to support decisions. We could have data-driven decisions to kind of get us there to secure our supply chains and, a myriad of other sort of things. So I think, being collaborative, being in a teamwork environment is critical today.
Access to good data is certainly a challenge in public sector procurement, but I know the Air Force has made great strides in this area. Let me close by just asking each one of you a question about what one of the most critical success factors is, in your opinion, to modernizing public sector procurement. And let me begin with the professor.
I see two major issues. And the first major issue is, of course, everything which has to do with digitalization in a wider sense. It's the digitalization of the process, but it's also the digitalization of the products we're buying in the future. This is really one great issue. And if I just can add one thing to what Mike said, if we look especially on the process cost, we know that more than half of the money in our economy are transaction costs in the meantime. So we spend more money for finding suppliers, for dealing with them, than really to manufacture the product. And I'm absolutely sure that digital technologies like electronic marketplaces are a huge help to improve that efficiency. That's the first thing. And the second thing is really the professionalization of the workforce. We have to move from administrative, that's what Mike already said, from administrative jobs to really strategic sourcing professionals. I think this is one of the major tasks we have to fulfill, especially in public procurement in Europe, because so far there is no, let's say, profession like a strategic public buyer. And we have to define that. And then it's a question of implementation. And then we have just to do it.
I agree 100% with that. Mike, what are your thoughts on a critical success factor for modernization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, similar to what the professor said, is we need to have the courage to be able to do things differently. We got to where we're at now by doing what we already did. But we know some of the strategic imperatives that we're facing. We need to change. We need to modernize. We need to become more efficient and effective. And that requires us to think differently. So that requires use of data. That requires looking at regulations. And rather than assuming I can't do this because it doesn't tell me that, looking at it and saying, why can't I do it this way? And it's oftentimes we limit ourselves. And then taking that mindset to our customers, teaming with them, internal and external, to build capacity, to build capability. When we're not afraid to team with people, and we can develop relationships and do it all legally and ethically and transparently, because we're using procurement funds, public procurement funds, we can still do that and build capacity and make our acquisitions better and engineer improvements into our processes, into our data, into how we do business to become more efficient. Because at the end of the day, procurement is what drives our customers to do their mission and be able to do what they're trying to achieve.
I think the need to break down silos is something that resonates with commercial organizations as well. I want to thank both of my panelists for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Up next, we have a short networking break, and then don't miss the second set of breakouts. Highlights include Peter Sowry from Centrica discussing building digital-first procurement organizations, Tom Poole from Amazon Business, who will be talking about next steps after implementing Amazon Business, and Kayush Modesia with Tom Fuchs to give insight into how they're adding efficiency to the process to drive high-value outcomes. We hope you can join us, and thank you again to our panelists.